Hi, everyone. Welcome to Story Mantra. I'm Anju Gattani, your host. And the reason I do Story Mantra is because I've lived the last 20 years of my life with nothing but the best of story and storytelling, as I have worked with New York Times bestselling authors, USA Today bestselling authors who told me I needed to learn how to write after 10 years of being an international freelance journalist, because writing the novel was a whole different elephant. In the journey of rejections, over 17 years of submissions, I gathered over hundreds of them, and I actually began to doubt myself. So this is where our guest of honor today comes in, Mr. Stephen James. Welcome to Story Mantra. I am so honored to have you.
Thank you very much. So I'm glad to be here.
Um, I can't tell you how exciting it is to have Stephen on, because this book, Story Trump Structure, changed my life. If any of you have not bought this book, now is the time to go buy it. The link is below the video. Get yourself the paperback version, because you're going to highlight this book like crazy, the way I have in here. And I just dropped something, which also tells you how much I keep this book with me wherever I go, to the point that I even have a Michael Haig bookmark with me in here. There you go. So who is Stephen James? The question should be, what has he accomplished? Because he is huge in the publishing industry. Stephen James is a national best-selling author whose award-winning, pulse-pounding novels continue to gain wide critical acclaim from sources including Publishers Weekly, the New York Times, the New York Journal of Books, RT Book Reviews, Booklist, Library Journal, and many others. He has received more than a dozen national and international honors and awards for his books, including 4 Christie Awards and an International Book Award for Best Suspense. His articles and stories have appeared in more than 80 different publications, including Writer's Digest magazine and the New York Times, which is where I heard of Stephen James, from this magazine. I began reading his articles. I began highlighting them, tearing them out, keeping them in folders. And that's when I realized who he was and what his accomplishments are, and why everything that he said began to make sense. Equipped with a unique master's degree in storytelling, James has taught writing and storytelling on 4 continents over the past 2 decades, speaking more than 2,000 times at events spanning the globe. I'm in awe. I don't know what to say, Stephen. Welcome. And again, super thrilled to have you. I don't even know, I'm out of words here. I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks for the kind introduction and also the kind words. And I'm glad to be here. And I always love to talk story and storytelling.
So let's start with me having a question that I've been burning to ask. What, in your opinion, is story?
Pursuit. So pursuit captures all of the essence that a story has. It has a character who clearly has a desire. He wants something and can't get it, or else he would have it and he wouldn't have to pursue it. Pursuit also has choices within it, has emotion because he can't get what he wants. And so it fulfills emotion, choice. And then there's a resolution, whether he gets what he pursues or she doesn't get what they're pursuing. And so at its core, at its very essence, a story is pursuit. Some people will say it's a journey, but a journey I don't think is as strong of an understanding as pursuit. Now within that, there are actually 4 elements that every story will have. And that is a character, which seems to make sense if there's a pursuit. So there's a character, there's a setting where things happen, there's a struggle, and there's pursuit. So those 4 elements are like 4 sides of a square. So basically, if you don't have a character, we don't know who the story's about. If you don't have a setting, we can't picture the story. If you don't have a struggle, it's just a list of events of a person, pursuing something or whatever. And if you have no pursuit, then it's just a person with bad things happening to them. So plot is different. Plot is simply the pathway that the character takes through the setting, during the struggles, along his pursuit. So a lot of people will get caught up thinking, well, what's the plot of my story? And so I don't even like to go there. I think it's much more helpful to ask about the 4 elements within the story Is the setting clear? Is the character irresistible? Is the struggle intimate? Is the pursuit, stirring and evocative? And just drop the whole idea of plot whatsoever.
Wow, that's a very unique way of looking at it. Um, and I wanted to read something, which caught my attention from the book, Story Trump Structure. Ta-da! There you are again. When I read this, I remember I highlighted it and I stopped and I thought about it because, as I told you, I was so confused with the rejections I was getting. And I started doubting my own story in terms of, am I writing a colored story in a market that won't sell colored works, which was clearly wrong because there is a lot of multicultural work out there, even though 15 years back there was. And then I read this. Um, Stories are transformations unveiled, either the transformation of a character or a situation, or more commonly, both. If nothing is altered, you do not have a story.
So stories, as I mentioned a second ago, have struggles. There are three realms of those struggles. There's internal, that's a question that needs to be answered. External is a problem that needs to be solved. And interpersonal, those are relationships that either need to be initiated or restored. And so you have these three areas. And within a story, you'll have transformation in one or more of those areas. In other words, if all you have is a character who just does activities without either transformative attitude, a transformative situation, or relationship, we will probably not feel satisfied as readers, because we want to see that. Now, among story theorists, there are different perspectives. Some people will say that stories are there to change characters. Some say that stories are there to reveal characters, and some that stories are there to test characters. So in my view, wherever the biggest promise of struggle, the most intimate struggle is, that's where readers will expect the biggest change. So for instance, in a coming of age story, you will probably have a lot of internal questions that are brought up. And that's where the readers will expect change, a new attitude. In a suspense story, your character might not change, but the situation will. He'll stop terrorists or catch the kidnapper, or whatever that might be. And in a love story, it's the relationship that's altered and transformed, not so much the characters themselves. So I think it's really helpful not just to say, because basically the sort of the word on the street, if you will, is that stories, your character must change. And over the years, I understand where people are coming from, and I understand, what they're trying to get at, and that's this idea of transformation, but it isn't always within the character. Sometimes it's between characters or around the character in the situation or relationships that he has.
So how about when we talking or when we refer to character growth and change within a story arc, which obviously arises because of conflict and tension?
Well, characters don't always change. So for instance, a lot of times we come to a story not because the character changes, but for the very reason that he doesn't change. Think of a sitcom. You don't come to a sitcom because the characters are fundamentally changed and transformed at the end of every episode. Or you don't come to a Jack Reacher, James Bond, Jason Bourne story because the character is fundamentally different. Sherlock Holmes, you don't come because he's fundamentally different and transformed at the end of every story. Why? You come because he's the same. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times we come to stories not so that we can see a character changed into something else. But in my view, really, wherever you emphasize the most intimate struggle, whether that's internal, in that case, you would expect a transformative moment within the character, between them, or among them. And so this whole idea of a story arc, I understand where people are coming from. It's just that sometimes it's not a story arc where the character changes, but it's a reader arc where our impression of the character is either solidified or changed at the end of the story.
Wow, that's a very, very different perspective. The reader arc. I've never heard that one before, but it definitely makes sense because it's the readers looking in on the story from the other side. So
Yes, and understanding, what the character is maybe capable of. So if you have the view that basically our personalities are intact, then you would probably look at story as revelation. In other words, that we would then see what the character is capable of. But if you look at character as not, personality as not so solid, solidified, but more malleable, then you might look at character change. So I think that what's most important for me is creating a character who's irresistible, that readers will identify with the struggles of that character, follow through with them. And it may be within the genre of story that you're working with, that they are changed and transformed into someone, fundamentally different. But very often it isn't the case. And I think the reason I bring all this up is a lot of aspiring authors will show me their work, and they'll start with a character who's not very likable. Like, I'll be reading about him and I'm thinking, I don't want to spend time with this character. I say, why are you doing that? And they say, well, because his character arc, right? He's going to become likable at the end. I'm like, no, nobody is going to want to stick with you through the story if they're not likable at the beginning. And so because this is taught so much that there has to be this arc, people will actually create characters who are not fun to be with at the beginning of their stories, thinking that's the arc that would be changed. But that's not the way that we will engage readers and get them into the stories that we tell.
wow. So what is your message to those writers who are confused along those lines? How should they reorient themselves?
Think of giving your character a pursuit or let me back up for a sec. Basically, at the core of a story is tension, and at the heart of tension is unmet desire. Okay, so basically stories are always about unmet desire, leading us forward, creating tension that drives the story forward. And so ask yourself, what does the character want? Seems like a pretty simple question. But what does he want that my readers also want? So, for instance, if he wants to love or be loved, your readers will identify with that. Or maybe he wants freedom. He feels constrained in the life that he has, and he just wants to be able to express himself and live free. Readers will understand. They've felt that way at different times. Or maybe he just wants adventure, or maybe security. Maybe he wants to feel that he has a place in the world. All of those things could be his driving desire within the story. And if they are, readers will, I get that. I know what that feels like. I've been there myself. Maybe it's peace or fulfillment, whatever it might be, acceptance, belonging, competence. And so all of those will drive your character forward and will draw your readers in.
Right. And I'd like to backtrack a little on what you just brought up, how the role of tension drives story and conflict and its unmet desire. Could you talk about the ceiling fan principle? I just love that. I love that.
Sure. So basically, whenever I was a kid, our teachers would always give us the same assignment after, say, summer vacation. They would say, write about what you did over the summer. And so we would write, I went to camp and I came home, I played video games, and I went swimming, and we visited grandma's house, or whatever it is, just this list of events. And so I went to one school years ago, I think a fourth grade class, and I said, please don't tell me what you did over the summer, but could anybody tell me about something that went wrong? So this boy raised his hand. I said, what happened? He said, well, my cousin came over to my house and we were having a contest to see who could jump the farthest off my bunk bed. I thought this could be good. I said, what happened? He said, well, he jumped first. He got pretty far. I said, I can get farther than that. I said, well, did anything go wrong? He said, well, I backed up to the wall to get a running start. That's a bad sign right there. He said, I ran and I jumped off the top bunk end. The ceiling fan was on. I got my head stuck in the ceiling fan, threw me against the wall, but I got farther. So if I would have asked this boy, what did you do? He would have said, I played with my cousin. But because I said, tell me what went wrong, he told me a story. So as you mentioned, I call it the ceiling fan principle. And that is, you do not have a story until something goes wrong. Now, some people will talk about the inciting incident of a story, and some will talk about the catalyst of the story. And And sometimes the terms are conflated and used back and forth. And I understand, again, where people are coming from. In my view, I want to look not just at an incident that sets the pursuit of the character in motion, but that actually causes them to have to overcome something to get there. So for instance, let's say that you're writing a story and your characters are remodeling their house. They knock down a wall and they find a bag of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars of money. Now, some people would say that's the inciting incident. I get where you're coming from. But let's say that nothing goes wrong. Let's say that you find the money. And then they're like, all right, we're going to pay off the house, pay for our kids' college, invest wisely, retire early, and travel the world. And that's what they do. Well, you see, finding the money had the potential to become a story, but all it became was a list of events. Remember, we had those 4 elements earlier. There's no struggle, right? There's setting, there's character, there's pursuit of happiness, but no struggle. We have no story. And so what as the writer, what you would need to do is then say, okay, they find the money, great. But now what goes wrong? What actually initiates the story, the forward movement of the story? And that is going to be where the heart of the story lies.
Wow. And that's what you emphasize in the book, which was, a real changer for me, because what you emphasized was it's not about the characters, it's not about the cast, it's not about the world building, it's about tension, continuous tension that drives story forward. And
yeah, go ahead.
No, and the escalation of it.
Yeah, some people will say there are plot-driven stories and there are character-driven stories. And so that becomes a common question people will ask at writers' conferences and so on. Well, do you write character-driven stories or plot-driven stories? And in my view, there are no stories that are driven by character and no stories that are driven by plot. But all stories, what's that?
Tension-driven stories.
Yes, all stories, you're right, are driven by tension, by unmet desire, whether that's internal, external, or interpersonal. And so the better question to ask is not, is it character driven or plot driven, but how does the tension drive this story forward? So again, where's the tension coming from? The unmet desire, and how is that then fueling the forward movement of the story? Now, something you mentioned a second ago too is this idea of tension and conflict. And I don't know if I really got into that much, differentiating those in Story Trump's structure, but in my later book, Troubleshooting Your Novel, I do discuss that a little bit. There's a difference, I think, in my view, between conflict and tension. So for tension is caused when you have mutually exclusive desires. So for instance, if I were fishing and I cast out my line and a great big fish catches hold of the lure, I start to reel it in. Well, he wants one thing, but if I get what I want, he doesn't get what he wants because he's going to get on my boat. Right. But if he gets what he wants, I don't get what I want because he's going to take off and be free. Okay, so there's tension in the line. That's what a story will have, is that tension. So what about conflict? Can conflict be what drives a story? Very often we'll hear conflict and tension used interchangeably. But I don't believe that they are interchangeable. In fact, let's say that you have a marriage, and in the marriage, the husband and wife don't get along well, but they've just resigned to the fact that they're going to remain married just for the sake of the kids. Like, they don't love each other anymore. They don't want to be together, but they have kids together. And they're like, for the sake of the kids, we're not going to get a divorce. Let's just pretend that's the case. Well, there's tension. There's plenty of conflict within their home, but because they've resigned to the fact that they're not going to get a divorce, there's no tension. The tension would only come if they were pursuing.
Because they've compromised, isn't that right?
Yeah, because they're no longer pursuing any
Seriously.
kind of resolution. Yeah. So a lot of times conflict alone doesn't drive a story forward. So very often we'll hear this idea that you need a character, you need a conflict, you need a conclusion or whatever. They all start with the letter C, I guess. But what you really need is a character with a desire and a pursuit where he faces things that go wrong and he has to overcome those on his way toward that transformative moment at the end.
In that case, can we say that tension is maybe not a definition, but tension is like um, the conflict of opposing forces or caused by?
I mean, it could be. I don't know. I just always steer clear of the word conflict simply because people, I think, use it without understanding the necessity of desire with intention. But I mean, certainly, I think I get where you're coming from. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so, you also talk about how tension, like you said, it's not plot driven or character driven, but tension driven, which is really what helped me. So thank you for one, for writing this book. And second, for solving a lot of problems in terms of which categories as writers we should fall in and our story should fall in. Because the fact that tension drives story just kind of smoothed out the playing field when I was in this dilemma. And it explained, well, as long as I have tension on every page, the reader will turn the page to find out what happens next. Which took away all the ambiguity of is it this or is it that? Does it fall in this category or that category? So the next question I have is now that we know that tension drives story and helps the book become a page turner, how do we orient readers to the story world and lock them in?
That's a good question. So early with our stories, we need to orient readers toward the genre of the story, the voice, sort of maybe the mood of that story itself. Introduce them to a character that they will want to cheer for or be afraid of. So in some cases, some cases the villain might appear first in that case, but we want to introduce a character within a coherent world. And so a lot of the beginning of a story, people have been told that you need a good hook for your story. And that's
my other question.
Yeah.
After.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that, but I just think that's one aspect of the orientation. It's not the most vital one. What's most vital is, I think, creating a character or drawing us in with a setting we can see and a character that we care about. Okay, so for instance, I'll just say the packaging of your story is part of the hook. The blurbs on the back cover copy and all of these things have to do with the hook. And you might say, well, what are you talking about? Like, how does that even work? Well, I remember a few years ago, we had this store down the street. It was called Blockbuster. You probably have never seen one of those before, but you would go in and you would pay them money and they would give you this circular thing that was shiny and you would bring it home and you'd have to take it back to them. Later, it was crazy. But I remember going in one time to rent a DVD and there was a movie called Quarantine. That I was looked interesting. It had a woman being dragged back into the darkness and screaming or whatever, and said most terrifying movie of the year. And I was like, this sounds kind of scary. I want to check it out. So I brought it home, pop it in. Well, the first few minutes, it's about a main character who's interviewing different people at not a police station, fire station. So EMTs and the firefighters and so on. So she's getting to know them, she's getting to know their backstory a little bit, and it kind of goes on. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and it's going on. Now, you might say, well, Steve, they should have started with a hook. They should have started with something like really dramatic and horrifying because it's a scary story. But they didn't do that. Well, why not? Because they trusted their audience. And because the packaging was actually part of what? The hook. So I'm watching it and I'm thinking, oh, things are going to get bad. Things are going to be bad. It's going to get, and it did. It got really tense and scary and frightening and all of those things. But I liked that they trusted the viewers. So they didn't play gimmicks. You know, a lot of times I'll read opening chapters of an author's and he'll have a gripping hook in the first paragraph or page and then drop back into giving us backstory about why the character was there in the first place. That doesn't work for me. I want if you're going to include some gripping hook, it needs to be the impetus to escalation, not something that then just causes us to go back and relive what we don't really care about.
Right. So let me ask you this then. Now that we're on the topic of the inciting incident or the opening conflict, so to speak, how should the opening conflict of any story differ from the escalation of or the progression of tension in the novel as we progress with the story?
Well, we introduce the pursuit or the tension or the opening, whatever, in a couple of different ways. Now, first, you might give your character what they want and then snatch it away. That's one way to do it. So, for instance, if your character wants a happy marriage, you could give her a happy marriage at the very beginning. The first chapter, you could show us how stable and how lovely her marriage is. So that's one approach. And then snatch it away. So for instance, she comes home and her husband is waiting for her at the door. He says, "Sweetheart, I've run a bath for you. And I have some lavender candles in there and I've poured some red wine for you. And I thought maybe after you take your bath, I could massage your feet while you watch Steel Magnolias." And she's like, "Oh, this is my perfect husband," whatever. Well, the more it goes on, the more readers are thinking something's going to go wrong. It's gonna go bad. So because we understand story and we know something's got to happen, and then something will. Maybe he gets abducted, killed. He's leaves her for someone else. Whatever it is that really moves the story forward. So that's one thing. Or you can show us what they want and dangle it in front of them. That's another approach. So that she could see a marriage like down the street that's working, and then she could pursue that. So you can give it to them, snatch it away, dangle it in front of them, or you can give them the opposite of what they want and force them to overcome it. And so, like, let's say that your main character wants freedom more than anything else. Well, you could start with him being in prison, and now he doesn't have what he wants, the freedom. And so he has to pursue that in some way throughout the story. So all of these are different ways that we can introduce that tension, that conflict, or whatever term you want to use, early on in the story to then build it for the rest of the narrative.
Wow. Well, that's a lot to take in, a lot of words of wisdom. And for all of you out there who really want to nail your story, get this book. I cannot stress it enough. You can see I've pretty dog-eared it and I highlighted it, and I read it every time and I still find more things to highlight because it's the truth of storytelling that we don't hear from, other books out there, which is we're forced to categorize ourselves. We're forced to categorize our ability as writers and then our story and our characters. And then we start wondering, well, where does all this fit in? And, Stephen says it very, very nicely. Story works when it's tension driven. That is what I gathered in a nutshell from this book. And of course, after that, your highlighter will just go crazy, as mine has. And the only reason it hasn't highlighted everything is because I hold myself back. Otherwise, I'll be reading yellow on every page and every word. What's a query tip that you could share with our viewers?
A query tip?
A query tip, and then, of course, a writing tip after.
Okay, so for querying, I would say you're not trying to actually tell the plot of your story, focus more on the pursuit. Again, this whole idea. And so in other words, a lot of people will say, I'm going to write a query letter, I'm going to pitch my story or whatever, and they'll just explain what happens within the story. And instead, I would say focus on what is the character pursuing, what does he or she want, what gets in the way, and how will that affect them. So it has to do more with the character's desire than it does the character's actions. Okay, so, and then a writing tip, I would say, let's see, how about this? People don't want to read about nice people doing nice things. They want to read about conflicted people doing difficult things. So very often writers will take it easy on their main characters. They won't make things as bad or as difficult as they probably could. But instead, we really want those tense moments. And it's almost like the more we care about a character, the more bad stuff we want to happen to them. Like, we want them to get out of it in the end, but we want them to go through the ringer. If they don't, we'll be left thinking, well, that was kind of boring. So we want that tension again, identification, empathy, and the tension of the character in the story.
So if you want that in Stephen's written words, I have it here. Page 38, stories revolve around dilemmas, not action. To build a story, you don't try to make right things happen, but rather make the right things go wrong.
Sounds pretty good.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I'll have to look up that quote and use it. I think it's worth remembering.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for being on part 1 of the video. It's been an honor to have you, to share dialogue with you about this fantastic book. For everybody, the link below the video is the purchase link. Also, the link to Stephen James's website. He has, how many books do you have out, Stephen?
Well, I mean, over the years, I've done about 54 over the years. Wow. But the last, 15 years has been mainly spent writing thrillers and suspense novels. So that's mainly, but before that, I did some nonfiction and other inspirational books and so on. So, but mostly 17 novels, we'll say that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, you'll get the purchase links below the video, so you know what to do. Buy story. If I haven't shown it already, here we go again. Buy the book. And then, of course, definitely check out conferences where Stephen is speaking at or presenting, now that we're in a better position to attend. And I would say it's worth every ounce of energy to hear this man talk, because he's incredible. He really is. Thank you so much, Stephen, for being on Story Mantra and for helping us walk through Story Trump's structure.
Thanks, Anju.
Yeah, bye.